Hello, welcome back. Today we are discussing poems of the early 20th century. So really stuff that was written between World War One and the early 30s. Really just three poems this time, but encompassing pretty major movements in an important period in American literature. A couple things before we jump in. Your essays are graded. Please do check the comments and grades, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any other questions or anything like that. I've done a preliminary tally of the blogs, and that will be in your My Grade section fairly soon, the first half essentially of the blogs. Also, we will have a quiz on Wednesday on poetry. I'll be developing that quiz today. It'll be online on Blackboard. And I believe that's all of the business to attend to. We're into the second half here. We've got another day of poetry after this, followed by nonfiction section and a final paper due, and then we're done. So it's been a whirlwind. I hope you're keeping up and getting something out of it, and sort of ideally this leads you into some other literary pursuits, other classes, or working on your own, reading on your own, that type of thing. Okay, so today I'd like to jump into the Harlem Renaissance first. I'll talk about Claude McKay and Langston Hughes before we jump over to a slightly different genre at the same time with T.S. Eliot. Okay, with the Harlem Renaissance. In many ways, this is a movement that went beyond poetry. Even though poets like Claude McKay and especially Langston Hughes are known as sort of central figures of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a flowering of artistic and cultural life centered around Harlem, but really centered around the Black experience and sort of Black society at the time. While Langston Hughes may be its best known writer, there was others like Zora Neale Thurston and Claude McKay, who was really a novelist who also wrote poetry, as well as musical figures, Duke Ellington, for example, Fats Waller. And so this is sort of the jazz age, and it's both political and sort of artistic or aesthetic here, this cultural upheaval. And it's a lot different from what T.S. Eliot's doing. T.S. Eliot is not writing rebel songs the way that Harlem Renaissance poets are. He's writing modernist poetry and really doing his own thing within the literary canon there. Okay, so Claude McKay first wrote If We Must Die, which became sort of a call to arms for the Black community, even though it does not say, use any of the words for Black Americans. I guess it would have been colored at the time. And it's sort of taken to heart as a, we will fight. We have to fight. It was written in 1919. The context is nationally, especially in the South, race riots, lynching, the retrenchment of racism and prejudice, obviously very, well before any civil rights era returns. He is also, McKay is a Jamaican American. He is well known as a novelist. He wrote 4 novels, including one that I thought would be an interesting little sidebar here, which is there was a book called Amiable with Big Teeth. It was a manuscript that he never published. It was later on during the Harlem Renaissance, right before World War II, and he's writing about Ethiopia and other political conflicts that are having major influence within the Harlem Renaissance and within sort of intellectual Black America at the time. This was authenticated by a guy younger than me named Jean-Christophe Cloutier, who came to UNCW last year to talk about the authentication process. He was working through an archives and found this manuscript that seemed written in a familiar way to him. Over several years and with help from other scholars, he managed to authenticate it as a lost manuscript by Claude McKay. It is now coming out. It's about to be published, if it hasn't yet. It's called Amiable with Big Teeth. Thought that would be interesting to hear, that little, sidebar there, where McKay and the Harlem Renaissance has become more and more famous and important, I guess, within literature over time. So to see this new book unearthed was pretty exciting. And If We Must Die, the poem is far better known and was considered a watershed type poem at this time. So read this one over. This is what I would call a rebel song, written finally published in 1922, but written a little bit before that in 1919. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, is how it begins. So you can see this pulls no punches, and is very much a song of rebellion, of standing up. And it's also a reaction to the previous leaders of the Black cultural movement in America, which were guys like W.E.B. Du Bois, who really talked more about integration and finding assimilation, finding one's way within white society. With the Harlem Renaissance, it's the beginning of, no, we'll find our own way as Americans, and we too are Americans, as Langston Hughes will say, and we will not necessarily assimilate, but we'll have our own cultural traditions and our own rebellion and sense of self and identity. So the McKay is on 414. It's a very short one, If We Must Die. And the Langston Hughes, written at the same time about, is in 1926. It's called I Too. I had given you a bad page number on that one, but I Too is on page 674, and it begins, I Too Sing America. Again, very overt statements of cultural identity and of independence, and of that it doesn't matter so much what the other great Black authors thought of it. W.E.B. Du Bois was famously critical of both Hughes and McKay as sort of exposing parts of Black identity that did not need to be exposed. He was very concerned about how Blacks would be perceived by whites in society. Both Hughes and McKay are saying, who cares? They do care, but that it is not the primary concern, that the art itself and that the advancement of Black culture should be the primary concerns, and for them they were. So take a look at these two. You're not going to see the same literary touch of perhaps Eliot and the modernists. The highbrow poetic sensibility is maybe not as in evidence, even though is there at times, but they're doing something different here. The goal is something different, which is to reach more people, which is reach the Black middle class and people internationally, and to make political statements and change. So it's a different project than Eliot has embarked on. I am keeping this very short here, or it feels short to me, maybe not to you. But let's jump over to Eliot. With Eliot, we are on, page 646. Now, Eliot wrote this book, or this poem, early in his life. He was 22 years old when it was published, and he'd been working on it before then. So this guy's your age when he's writing this, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And it achieves him international fame almost immediately. He is entered into the sort of clan of great poets led by Ezra Pound. But to back up a little bit, Eliot is an American born in St. Louis who emigrates to Britain and becomes a British citizen. So he's sort of a hybrid there as far as nationality. He is writing this when Prufrock is written in 1915, right around World War I. And as you read Prufrock, you'll see some lines such as, the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. What do you think that yellow fog might be? If you think about the context of World War I, it becomes pretty clear. So one of the things to look at in this poem, you see it right from the start, is how is he reacting to romantic poetry? Does romantic poetry exalt, for example, the mustard gas creeping into the trenches and killing? Would a romantic poet, which is the dominant poetry of this time, would a romantic poet have written the most famous line probably of this with the opener, let us go then you and I when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Etherized meaning anesthetized. Now, just as you were set up for, with this line, when the evening is spread out against the sky, you're ready for the romantic image to bring in, some image with reference to Dante Alighieri, which Eliot does, that would be pretty or literary, romantic, poetic. Eliot's going to turn that on its head and say this city looks like a patient etherized upon a table. Again, with a certain allusion to war here, to the someone brought back from the trenches where they have been hit by the yellow fog. So one big element is this war and the historical epic in which he's writing this. But even probably more important here is that he's using a stream of consciousness style and as well as early modernism, like Faulkner, like um, James Joyce. He is going to bring you in. He's going to be purposefully ambiguous in order to enable future or further and better reader response, some of which he will privilege himself, some of which he will try to draw from you. Others he will hope that you will just bring to the table as your own. So that's modernism. You take an active role in this as reader, and that's what Eliot's trying to do. So this can be read different ways. On one hand, this is a 22-year-old writing, but our narrator in here, Prufrock, seems like an older or at least late middle-aged man. He's writing about his failures, his difficulties, some of them personal, not having a date or a girlfriend or perhaps a wife or a soulmate, certainly not having carnal relations, and feeling that he's missing on this major part of life. But it's also the story of a writer with incredible ambition, a writer who is trying to consummate this relationship with a reader, but who feels that he is never quite good enough, has never achieved enough, that he's just essentially a crab along the seafloor, not immortal, not one of the greats. So it's this writer struggling with his own securities, some of them personal, some of them literary, some of them on a much larger scale, societal, and dealing with war and the clash of civilizations at the time. So there's a lot going on here. And he's using more poetic devices, such as slant rhyme, which we saw in Emily Dickinson, where the rhyme doesn't quite fit. It's not a perfect rhyming limerick type meter and rhyme scheme, but there is a lot of rhyme, internal rhyme, slant rhyme, which is like slightly off rhyme. You'll see him playing with these sounds and how the way the sounds fit together. Sometimes for contrast, they don't quite fit. Other times to sort of pay you off with the rhyme that does fit in the poetic form the way a reader is used to within romantic poetry. So reading all this through, I'd like to hear in the blogs and the Prufrock, I think, is probably the primary and dominant poem of today to write about. It's an in-depth and complicated one. What exactly is he writing about? What is he trying to say? And what do you feel is at the heart of this sort of journey, this internal monologue journey inside his mind? Which we'll see again, which you saw in Joyce and others as one of the staples of modernism. Okay, I think that covers my notes for Prufrock, though there's a lot more to it, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it on the blogs, as well as the quiz coming up on Wednesday. So give this one, when you read these poems, you've got to give them multiple reads. I would use a pen in hand till you start to see what he's up to. You put the puzzle pieces together first, and then start to notice the more sophisticated poetic devices that the poet is using, and try to convey theme and enhance the effect of that theme in the reader, or those themes, if it's more than one. Okay, that's what I've got for you today. Thanks a lot for listening, and I will see you tomorrow, and look for you on the blogs.